And as a reminder, these sessions will be recorded, and we will post them on the HPC site on our website and into the portal for y'all's reference and for the future. So today we are starting off with Jim Savage. And Jim Savage is a global risk management strategist and practitioner with extensive experience in the energy industry and in the U.S. Secret Service, including assignments in high-risk locations. Throughout his career, he has been a trusted partner and advisor to top management and the board of directors, valued for strategic planning, threat assessment, policy development, crisis management, asset protection, and emergency preparedness. As principal of Savage Global Strategies, Jim advises corporations, nonprofit organizations, educational institutions, and private sector clients in developing comprehensive security programs and workplace violence prevention programs for operations domestically and abroad. He also provides training and personal risk management advice to high net worth clients, families. His affiliations include being a member of the International Security Management Association, FBI and Domestic Security Alliance Council, American Society for Industrial Security, International Association of Chiefs of Police, and Overseas Security Advisory Council. Welcome, Jim Savage, and to you I give the floor.
Much, Bill. I just really appreciate the opportunity to visit with everybody today, and I know it would be ideal if we were in person, but we're going to have to roll with the circumstances being what they are. Also want to just acknowledge, I know all the hard work, preparation, and time that everybody on this call has been investing to try to prepare for the return of their students and maintaining a safe and secure learning environment. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is security assessments, which are just so important to security planning and keeping students and faculty safe. And I appreciate the overly generous introduction, Bill, and I think the takeaway there really is just that I'm passionate about what I do. I have performed dozens, if not hundreds, of different types of security assessments, not only for the government as a Secret Service agent, but also in the private sector. But having said that, I'm still a student, and I learn. And each campus, each building is different. And I like to bring this broad background into play when I'm looking and scrutinizing facilities and schools. So I'm not an engineer, I'm not a techno geek, I'm not an AV specialist or a low voltage wiring expert. But I have learned quite a bit as a consumer of services, a C-suite level security director for a major international oil corporation, to understand the value of assessments. And that's why I chose this topic to talk about today. And, you know, there's always a people aspect to security that I'll touch on. And if any of you have heard any of my other presentations, you know, I'm very focused on the behavioral aspects or components of security. And there is a way to look at it from a programmatic point of view when we talk about security assessments. So, you know, with my Secret Service background, I have a particular emphasis on prevention. That'll show in some of the conversation here, and it certainly shows in the way I approach an assessment. And I just believe that even though response is a critical component of a solid security plan, and those plans need to be assessed when doing a security assessment, that prevention side is super important as well. But let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about, you know, the value proposition, assessments can be expensive depending on the application, the size of the campus, the school, the footprint, et cetera. But I do believe there certainly is high value. Much like the purpose of an assessment is to determine where are you strong, where are you weak. It's much like analogous to a physical examination. No doctor is going to write you a prescription until they have a chance to give you a thorough checkup. And at high level, that's really what we're talking about, the purpose of an assessment. But also, the last thing anybody wants to have is a surprise. So an assessment, when properly done, should really reveal those areas of your security plan and your building and your processes, again, that are strong, but more importantly, where they're weak. So that being the case, excuse me one second. I think that avoiding surprises, for you is important because if it's a surprise, that means you haven't had an ample time to talk about or think about your responses. I think it also establishes a baseline for you to work from, and if you will, make progress that you can demonstrate and actually chart that goes into the future. I will say this, security is as much art as it is science. There's certainly core and important principles, but really the standard of that's applied to the security profession, unlike safety that may have OSHA regulations, things like that, the big standard really is reasonable and foreseeable. That's the standard. Your security program and your mitigation measures will be judged against, particularly in a court of law, should that happen. And this means that you're going to be expected to have planned and implemented reasonable protection measures to prevent, let's say, an active shooter or other active violence. And yes, now active shooters, as you know, on school campuses are actually considered reasonable and foreseeable due to the sad legacy and the statistics that we all know exist. So I will say this, a word about assessments. They can help as I'm preaching here, but they can hurt you as well, and you need to be cognizant of that. If your assessment report contains findings or gaps that are significant that you ignore, and an incident occurs that involves one of these unaddressed findings, your culpability, liability is arguably greater than if you had never performed that assessment. So you're probably thinking right now, well, why should we even do one? Well, you do need, obviously, as I talked about, to really know where you stand, where your security plan stands, where your facilities stand in terms of their ability to resist threats. But there is a workaround for the downside of assessments that reveal gaps. And one is you can actually protect assessment findings through the attorney-client work product, or structure the assessment so that the assessment is done on behalf of a law firm that you engage, so that, again, the ability to access it freely by the plaintiff or others is much more difficult. Or it's possible to structure an assessment to where, if there are serious gaps, that those are handled through verbal briefing rather than in writing. And last but not least, the value proposition for conducting assessments is that the assessment really enables a conscious and deliberate decision process about the risk pursuant, to the identified gaps. In other words, what do you want to do with those gaps and the risk that they represent? Do you want to own it? In other words, accept it? Do you want to transfer it or insure it? The main thing is to have the ability not to be surprised by these things, but to have a very deliberate decision-making process about what to do with it. The one thing you don't ever want to be, once again, is surprised by risk. Bill. So we're going to talk now about, you heard me speak of reasonable and foreseeable, the civil liability aspects. I chose a few slides here that we're going to run through that relate to the Las Vegas lawsuit relating to the active shooter there at the Country Western concert a few years back, where there was a massive lawsuit that was filed against MGM and the Mandalay Bay Corporation, as in the hotel. And basically it alleges, look, you had a big event, and there were things that were reasonable and foreseeable, such as acts of violence, and that you, as in MGM Mandalay Bay, did not have the proper planning, resources in place, and that it was reasonably foreseeable there was going to be loss of life or injury. And so once again, if there's additional justification that needs to be made as it relates to return on investment, lawsuits like this tend to highlight and also set precedent, if you will, for other lawsuits along those lines. So next slide, Bill. Continuing with this theme, the plaintiffs allege that the premises owners and operators had a duty of reasonable care in protecting and safeguarding the people there, and that they breached their duty of reasonable care, resulting in tremendous loss of life. And again, these types of lawsuits can be precedent setting. And, in the case of schools where we're talking about right now, again, referring back to the legacy, there have been so many over the years, and the loss of life has been so significant that it'd be very difficult to argue that you did not need to have reasonable precautions in place, because it was going to be an unlikely or unforeseeable event for you. Let's go to the next slide. So, perhaps a good security assessment at that venue or hotel in Las Vegas might have highlighted some of the gaps or the lack in planning. Hard to say. I do know this: Las Vegas does host over 6,700 special events a year. It's about 500 a month. Is it possible that complacency crept in? Perhaps. That's easy to do. When things are going well, we tend not to be too critical of what we already have in place. And of course, I'd argue that's one of the values of assessments being conducted. A quick sideline, as a security director myself, in a corporate setting, we had never experienced an incident on our campus yet. I thought it'd be a good idea to put fresh eyes on our campus and facilities. And in fact, I was surprised at some of the observations there that were made, and they were legitimate. And I thought long and hard about how could this have happened right under our own noses. And in fact, in this case, there were some remodeling plans that had started, some construction that had started, and then we had paused. And if those construction projects would have been completed, then those gaps would not have remained. However, because the construction was paused for an extended length of time, it actually opened up some structural vulnerabilities that you know, in our own plan, in our own heads, we knew wouldn't be there when we finished with the projects, but midway through the project, they were there, and they were there for an undue length of time. So, you know, just a good idea that no matter how good you feel about your plans and your mitigations, your solutions in place, it's a really good idea, much like an audit, to have fresh eyes and a third party look at your facilities, your plans, and your processes. Let's go to the next slide. And so some of the more common incorrect assumptions, if you will, some of these may resonate with you, some maybe not. And of course, one of the things that not usually said, but often thought, is that, look, it won't happen here. In other words, a major incident won't happen here, and we've never had a problem. So why should we make the investment? Why should we endure the pain and effort to have an assessment conducted? My favorite saying is one I heard from a PhD who studies human behavior and also studies industrial accidents, is this, quote unquote, things that have never happened before happen all the time. And if you think about that, it's so true. I mean, what are all the different things that have never happened before that continue to happen? New planets are discovered, quote unquote, extinct animals are discovered. We've had horrific incidents like 9/11, and guess what we're in the middle of right now? The pandemic. So we've never experienced this before like this, and it's new. So I think, you know, assessments and those conducting the assessment that engage with their clients, in this case, school counterparts, should really be thinking outside the box and mentally preparing for a wide range of incidents and disruptions. Need to think about investing and physically preparing as your budget and as your leadership and culture allows. You know, an assessment should focus on the gaps in your plans and your security building features, which currently exist, that make your school susceptible, that is vulnerable to reasonable and foreseeable threats. The assessment process, the actual process of going through it, should give you an opportunity to think about, as I mentioned, outside the box, about the risk posed by future threats. So there should be thought given to, okay, this may not be a threat now, but let's look down the road. And look, it's the assessor's job or consultant's job, or in my case, it would be my job to know what's reasonable, foreseeable, based on my experience, industry trends, and the history in your space in school security. Look, as an example, explosives used by school students in carrying out targeted acts of violence, active shooter scenarios, is on the increase. The evidence supports it. This means there's a foreseeable trend into the future. There's many documented cases of use and attempted use, even going way back to Columbine. And that was not successfully, explosives were not successfully implemented, but they were present on site, and they just were not effective. And there have been multiple incidents since then where shooters have incorporated that into their plans. Why am I bringing this up? Well, so I would ask you, what's your plan to search for, isolate, and remove an improvised explosive device with the least amount of disruption and destruction in your school? Does your local police department have the capability? Do they have a robot? What's their response time, or do they have to call to another department? These are things that, you know, you really need to know. These are questions that, as an assessor, I would want to know. And do you know what a safe standoff distance should be if there's a device that's located in a locker? Does that mean 40 feet, 400 feet? And your plan should account for that. As far as other, you know, I say incorrect assumptions, This is a waste of money. We already have security. It's one thing to have security presence. It's another thing to have real security as a condition. And, an assessment should let you know if you have the proper conditions in place by processes, training, actual physical devices to create a secure environment. I know there's kind of a natural belief that if you work somewhere with good people, that everyone is good. And I don't want to go too dark and deep on this, but there's a 1% everywhere in every staff, faculty, office building, population, group, organization, club. There's always that 1%. And given the fact that domestic violence is a factor in security for the workplace and schools as well, good people can have issues that follow them into the workplace, or in your case, into the school. And so there needs to be a system to identify and make people want to share if they're having issues, but school faculty and others need to be able to identify if potentially there's domestic violence threats that could in fact creep onto a campus. And the other kind of typical human belief, I have to remind myself of this on a daily basis, is the future is an extension of the present. That's a myth. So the good news there is just because we're quarantined or we have COVID today doesn't mean we're always going to have that, which is obviously good news, thankfully. So, I think back to that saying, things that have never happened before happen all the time. So just try to bear that in mind. Let's go to the next slide, Bill. So what should every assessment contain? So we're talking like bare bones basic, is that every assessment should have a thorough review of the campus, the buildings, the facilities, storage, the whole footprint. It should have the assessor, assessment team should conduct interviews with a cross section of the staff to get an idea of, again, you're looking for the weak points, strong points, more interested in the weak points, any history that could inform your assessments. And I'll talk a little bit more about trying to get to a great assessment from just a basic assessment here in a few minutes. Every assessment should certainly review access control devices and procedures. I mean, let's face it, we want to know who's coming in and that they are in fact authorized and permitted to be there and that they're not a threat. Every assessment should contain a technical inspection of security systems, cameras, alarms. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. Those are important elements. By no means are they to be solely relied upon, but they're important elements. And of course, crime statistics for the area. Hey, what's going on in the area that's of record? So we know that what the threats may be. We may be surprised. We may be surprised by volume or lack of volume. But I also I'd want to look at the nature, the time of occurrence, those types of things. And of course, lighting is super important, not only for off hours, but during the shorter winter days and months where students are on site, faculty's on site in darkness, either coming or going or both. And we're now going to go to the next slide if we can, Bill. Most commonly overlooked items.
Jim?
Yes, sir.
Sorry. I just want to encourage people. Anybody have any question, please feel free to mute yourself and ask away anytime during the presentation. And Jim, I actually have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
How important are video surveillance systems?
Well, Bill, I'm glad you brought that up. As I alluded to a moment ago, good video systems are valuable in two respects. One, there is a deterrent value, maybe not as great as we would like. It's they offer deterrent value for rational people that do not want to be caught, apprehended, identified, or detected. And they also, if properly done, they can offer a really good investigative or even screening resource. But I will caution that, security systems, technical systems, no matter what they may be, including camera systems, as valuable as they are, they are not to be solely relied upon. And we know from experience that even if you had someone looking at a video screen of all your cameras, that the average human can only last 10 or 15 minutes before fatigue sets in. So you can't rely on those to necessarily detect suspicious or concerning behavior. But good question. So let's talk about some of the most commonly overlooked items. While we're talking about video systems, camera height is typically recommended at 8 to 10 feet. And I would just say that in some cases, it needs to be even higher than that. But where you have people coming and going and a lot of pedestrian traffic, I would say it needs to be no higher than 8 feet. And why is that? And that is, if you have someone with a cap on, ball cap on, or hat, when you get eight feet and above, you lose part of the straight on facial resolution and features that you would get by a lower placed camera. In a situation where you're either looking for someone or you have at some point down the road advanced analytics where you would want to be alerted if an individual came on your campus, or if there was some type of act that occurred, an incident that occurred, and you want to identify an unknown individual, having that straight on facial shot is just so important. There's a lot of law enforcement databases, by the way, that if you bring them a high quality straight on facial shot, not an elevated camera shot, a straight on facial shot, and it's a serious enough crime, they can match. They can do a match through the driver's license photo database to identify your unknown subject. So other things that are overlooked, and this is a big one for me, not just at schools, but also offices and other environments where, for the most part, your workforce, but do you really know your contractors and third parties that service your facility? Or perhaps, when I say service, maybe they're even assigned full-time there. The old worn out adage, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If all your employees are background checked and you feel good about them, but you willingly invite other people who are not to spend time on your campus at your facility, you're really undermining and really kind of providing a portal, if you will, for a threat to bypass your existing screening and background check protocols in place that can result in some some undesirable activities, everything from theft, fraud to worse, actual assaults. But other overlooked items, crisis packets for first responders. What am I talking about there? Do you have, when the police show up, if there's a major incident on your campus, do you have a packet, either hard copy or electronic, you can put in their hand with absolutely no delay, that has your blueprints of the facilities, photos, access keys, etc. And if you don't, there's a delay that's going to be incurred when you may not want it, which obviously seconds and minutes count in major incidents. Um, you know, crime, sex offender, and environmental mapping. I think that crime and sex offender stats and research are super important. I will say the environmental side is something that I like to do. I think I note that maybe on the next slide about being great rather than just good. You want to know what context you're operating in, to include even surroundings. Crisis plans, communication plans, again, so important as part of creating a secure environment there, and knowing that in the case you can't prevent, how are you going to respond? And what are the quality, the frequency, the currency of those plans, particularly the way you communicate in an emergency and even internally and externally, in the event of an issue that may span hours or days if there's something unfolding on campus, like a threat, like we've seen in so many schools, where someone perhaps posts something online and they make threats. You know, how you communicate that internally within the school, but outside the school, is very important for protection of your reputation. I touched on this earlier, special event plans not being updated. Look, conditions change, venues change. Those have got to be periodically reviewed and looked at. We all know the importance of having designated, hardened, safe rooms or areas to go to. Oftentimes the ball gets dropped as to really identifying those places specifically where faculty, staff, teachers know where to go. And then if there is the ability to harden up those rooms or the doors or the door facings with some just simple locks, oftentimes there's great intentions, but the follow through isn't there. The quality testing of emergency action plans, specifically active shooter. We talked a little bit about that as far as like a crisis or incident response time. It's very important that the plans are realistic, particularly with active shooter. I know there's a lot of situations, a lot of planning, incorrect assumptions, if you will, that, if the police will be there 5 minutes, problem will be solved. But most of these shootings, as you know, are over in under 5 minutes. And although your police department you may even have a school resource officer or somebody armed on site, even if they're there in a matter of minutes to you, it's still going to take a few minutes to really identify exactly where the threat is and move in to address it. So your action plans there have got to really be practical and well thought out. So I can't miss an opportunity to talk about the threat assessment program. Some of you may have heard my previous presentations. We're talking about behavioral threat assessment program. We're not talking about assessment of a structure here. We're talking about, do you have a program in place to identify individuals on your school campus, be they students or faculty, that are under such severe stress, perhaps harboring a grievance, that may actually be moving down what we call the pathway to targeted violence. That is, they are moving towards actually carrying out an act because they have a grievance they can't let go of. They have decided that the solution is something violent, and they are preparing to carry that out, and which can all be accelerated by stressors such as isolation, financial, marital, loss of job, etc. So, and do you have a communication mechanism in place in your school to formally report that? And do you have a threat assessment team, a multidisciplinary team that will see that information when it comes to light and evaluate it, act upon it if need be, intervene and offer resources to keep an individual who may be on that pathway from going any further down that pathway. Hand in hand with that, you have domestic violence awareness training, because that is a factor in workplace violence, to include schools as well. If there's statistically, there's a strong linkage between domestic violence incidents happening at home and then the perpetrator of that often following their victims into the workplace or just carrying out an act because of that. I'm also very interested, again, hand in hand with the threat assessment program and kind of the safe climate there, is the availability of mental health counseling. How easy is it for staff, faculty, teachers, and students to get the kind of counseling referrals that they need to keep from moving down that pathway, to intervene early, to keep a small issue small and keep it from escalating? And what suspicious mail and parcel handling procedures are in place that you have at your facility? Are packages opened in one particular area? Is it close to the student population to where if there was a substance, a powder in there that could easily be spread, do you have a way to contain it? Do you have rubber gloves? Do you have a poster on the wall that kind of reemphasizes to those that open mail what to look for and then how to handle if there's something suspicious? And then my final bullet point here is bolt cutters. Does anybody know why that's on the list for most commonly overlooked item, and why I would have possibly put that on the list? You hear anything, Bill? So, okay, there is a reason for that. And it goes back to the horrific 2007 Virginia Tech shooting. Because the shooter had actually chained the doors of Norris Hall together. By the way, Norris Hall is where 30 of the 32 victims were killed. He chained those together from the inside. That caused a minimum 5-minute delay by the police. And the police finally, because they did not have bolt cutters, the way that they were able to finally get in was by using shotguns to shoot through the doors and finally gain entry that way. Not a very efficient way to do it, but they did what they had to do, and I commend them for it. A little risky too, because you really don't know who or what's on the other side of those doors. But again, they did what they had to do, so I applaud them. So, that's a very simple tool that I guess if you didn't have that context or background, you may say that's ridiculous. But again, I think what's really important here, school shooters and those that commit these acts of targeted violence, they are part of a subculture, and they watch and study other school shootings and incidents, and they try to one-up each other in terms of the body count, as horrible as that sounds. And they also like to see other methods that were used, to include explosives, or in this case, how to prevent the quick response from first responders. And so that's why the idea of having ways to overcome or circumvent something as simple as a chain around a door, you can do it, prevent that delay. You're literally saving lives in that case. Let's go to the next slide. All right, yeah, so just following along the theme, talking about the difference between good and great. I think when we talk about assessing the technical mitigation measures of school security plans, like the camera system, the alarm system, I like to get out there and actually do a real-time challenge of it. I want to see how your cameras work in different forms of daylight, low light, darkness. I want to see, can they read my license plate if I'm in a part of your school area that I shouldn't be. I also want to know, how easy is it to retrieve footage and get it into the hands of the police or the authorities? Is that something that one person can do? If so, that's a single point of failure, we call it. Or are there multiple people that can do it? Are there multiple steps? Does everyone know how to do it? Because sometimes, again, there's situations where you need to quickly gather evidence or screenshot of an individual and get it to the police because time may matter. Also, I think differentiating a great assessment from a good one is actually doing the mapping and the pictures of nearby sex offenders. That should be part of the report. And I touched on this earlier. I think also there's no reason not to know whether there's any toxic record of toxic waste spills or designated industries. They can be very small businesses in your area that are of record with the EPA as disposing of hazardous waste. It's also, I think, important to know there are any, buried pipelines nearby, because obviously those can cause issues. If there's a rupture, are there train tracks nearby that haul hazardous chemicals? What if there's a derailment? That's just part of painting the full picture, so you know what to guard against, or in an unlikely but possible situation, how you would react. I also think that you can get greater value out of assessments by actually not just relying on crime stats, but actually talking to the local police. We know there's things that go on in neighborhoods and on sites that never make it to the statistical heap. And the local police, whoever's working that beat, will know. Same thing with just generally kind of first responders there. And look, to the extent there's business owners and others around there, I have found great value in going just in the immediate area and talking to others that operate a business or live in that area as to what their experience has been with crime and security type incidents. It just informs the assessment. And I also like to ask for those institutions, businesses, schools that have third-party contracts, what do those contracts look like in terms of the screening obligations for contractors that will be working at your school? What does it say that the third party is required to do, and are they required to share with you the findings of background checks? And are you permitted to, at any time you want, to look at their findings as well? I've honestly never seen a contract that allows that, but there's absolutely no reason that it can't be written in there. And I've actually suggested that be done in one case where there were issues on site because of third-party contractors, and the contractor company itself was not performing the screening procedures that they had advertised. And so we took it upon ourselves as kind of the client in that case to be much more proactive in that screening process and wanting to know what those results look like for people that worked amongst our workforce. Mail handling procedure and training review, talked a little bit about that. It's just important. Once again, threats come in through the mail, through parcels. You want to have a consistent standard of awareness and just very simple procedures on what to look for, how to handle. I think a great security assessment also looks at the medical capability that you have on site. What do you have in terms, I know that first aid kits, those are certainly on site, but what do they have in them? Do they actually have tourniquets or ways to stop the arterial bleeding? Do you have staff that are trained in the use of tourniquet? There's some simple, free, stop the bleed type campaigns that I really, really recommend. And again, that's part of creating a secure condition, if you will, for your school. And I think that's something an assessment can highlight. Evaluation of the incident response plans, we talked about that. I'm really doing a deep dive on those, not just a checklist. Do you have them? Let's take a look at them. Let's go over them and see if they're realistic. And I also think the presentation and discussion of the actual assessment report itself is super important, because you can only say so much in writing. And again, if there's some serious things there, maybe you've decided ahead of time, we don't want that in writing. We'd rather talk about that, which I think there's real value for that to avoid the downside of assessment reports. And of course, I think a prioritized list of gaps and recommendations is something that's super important, because there's going to be a lot of data, or should be, in that assessment report, and you need to know what's important and what kind of value you're going to get out of it. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about just ways to depict or illustrate kind of risk and mitigation prioritization. Let's go to the next one. So, not only are we talking about we're prioritizing the actual risk itself, but we're also going to talk about the mitigation prioritization of it. Is it something we should do right now? Is it something we should wait on? What's the actual vulnerability, the problem that we're trying to solve? Those are the types of graphical or visual depictions that are going to be part of a good security assessment. And look, there's all kinds of formats. I've worked individually. I've worked on a lot of teams. There's all kinds of security assessment templates out there. And as long as they contain and address the items that we're talking about, they're fine. And there's different ways to present the findings, this is just a little snapshot here of a way, again, to show the risk and mitigation prioritization. Let's go to the next slide, Bill. So on this slide, this is just kind of it's an extract from a recent assessment performed for a school, and the purposes are for what we're talking about are illustrative. It's very direct, indicates, like down there at the bottom where I've highlighted and circled, what kind of threat is it? What's the value of the mitigation measure? What's the complexity of the mitigation measure? What's the cost of it? And ultimately, what's our perception of the risk if you don't do it? In this case, we're talking about video surveillance systems that are in use throughout the school, and the fact that there's actually a couple of them that are in use. And the risk there is look, not only may we miss an opportunity to capture suspicious activity, but it's going to be really cumbersome to try to rapidly pull video, and actually the system's being dated. We're probably not going to end up with the ability to see individuals in the detail that we would like. So I'm going to move on in the interest of time to the next slide here. This is a little different where it's kind of an implementation matrix, but it's at a glance. You can see that this type of chart just shows improvement value of a solution versus kind of the cost and risk. And you can see at a glance, immediately there's nothing in the red zone. So that's good news right there. And that most of the findings, like, the hiding places, remote panic buttons, and upgrading some of the alarm components, you can get high value out of those, and those are a low cost. Most of these observations are in the green zone, which is exactly where you want them. So let's talk about, on the next slide, Bill, how to get the max value from an assessment process. Hey, number one is make sure you select an independent consultant or firm that has no product affiliations. And you want somebody that has a broad security background, that has been involved in planning, been involved in prevention, has actually been involved in operations, so that the assessment process is not a theoretical exercise. Because remember, assessments, as I mentioned, they're science and art, and the art of it is having enough experience to know when things are important and when they're really not. And I think also to get max value, you can, if you have particular concerns about your processes, your plans, your facilities, your buildings, you can modify that assessment to reflect, your priorities. And along those lines, look, an assessment's only going to be as good as the information that's provided to the assessor or assessors. So to get maximum value, get involved in the process. Don't be a spectator. Don't be afraid to share the bad stuff, things that have happened, mistakes that have been made, equipment that's not working. Don't try to, misrepresent things that are, in fact, can be really helpful for the assessment team. So I think maintaining rapport with the assessment team is just super important. That way it can be a learning experience for you as well. And have your technical people available to assist. You can't do these types of like real-time challenges on video systems and really dive deep into those unless the people that know how to operate them in depth are available. So that's so important. And look, challenge and ask questions. So that's really an important aspect of the threat assessment process. The security assessment process is where if you don't understand or if you believe that something is being given too much weight in terms of priority of a risk or is being overlooked, if you are maintaining rapport with the assessment team, you're not going to have any problem bringing that up, hopefully in the process. But even at the end, when the report is rendered, it's your product, you've paid for it. Be satisfied and don't walk away scratching your head as to why something was on there. So I am going to wrap it up with that final comment, not knowing if anybody there may have a question or two, but certainly open for questions.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have just a few minutes before our next session starts, but we do have time for a question or two. Does anybody have a question for Jim?
Well, if there are no questions, it's been a pleasure. I hope some of these details and insights that I've shared with you have been valuable to you. I know that you have a lot on your plates right now, but I'm a huge proponent of security. I think the return on investment, as difficult as it may be to calculate, is there. And if I can help in any way, this last slide should show my contact information as well as Joe's from Building Solutions. We'd be happy to help you in any way or entertain, some offline commentary. It's been my pleasure. And thank you so much. And I hope you, your families, and your team stay healthy and safe going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jay.